Welcome. This is titled as the UK Reproducibility Network Regional Meeting on Northumbria's Open Research Week site. We've titled it UKRN Local Network Leads, What They Do and Why. My name is Will Gawned, so I'm here representing UKRN from the office side or central side, which is based in University of Bristol. Our speakers are from other institutions, but also representing UKRN as local network leads or LNLs. And UKRN is a collaborative network of researchers, research enablers, institutions, and other sectoral stakeholders working to support the UK research system to be outstanding in conducting and promoting rigorous and transparent research. So the three UKRN local network leads that are joining us are David Smailes, based at Northumbria University, Grant Abt from University of Hull, and Will Cawthorn from the University of Edinburgh. And they're fulfilling the local network lead role at those institutions, which is an incredibly important and largely voluntary role, supporting and engaging with the community to help spread the message of rigorous, transparent, and reproducible research. So there'll be three presentations in that order: David, Grant, Will. There's opportunities for some questions after each, and then a panel Q&A at the end. Myself will join that. We're a very small group, so any questions, feel free to unmute and just speak up. And I think without further ado, I'll pass on to you, David.
So my slides are on open research practices and what I call the peer review problem. So this is our third kind of open research event of the day at Northumbria. So I think kind of in terms of Northumbria staff and students might have a bit of open research fatigue, and that might be kind of partly why our attendance isn't great. So apologies about the kind of schedule and around that. Often when I have done talks as kind of local network lead for UKRN, it often used to come after a guy called Thomas Pollitt, and Thomas, for all of his qualities, is often a grumpy guy and is kind of like, oh, we've done this, but like we're not doing this thing yet. And so I'd often try and give like a really kind of optimistic kind of follow-up to Thomas's talk. And today I thought I'd kind of, because I'm not following Thomas, I'd give a bit more of a kind of like, ooh, here's a problem, here's a thing that I think isn't going so well with open research. And so it's about peer review. And a bit of this is about kind of the stuff that I think I do as a local network lead, and maybe either stuff that maybe need to change about that, or stuff that kind of more broadly, like the open research kind of ecosphere maybe needs to think about a bit more. So to start off, like we've made a bunch of progress, I think, over the past like 10-15 years in terms of open research. So I think everybody's pretty confident that a bunch of open research practices are becoming much more common. So I think there's pretty good evidence that pre-registration is much more common since 2010. So this is a quick search of Scopus, looking at abstracts that mention pre-registered or pre-registration, down at about kind of 100 publications per year back in 2010, and north of 1,000 publications now. And so I think even kind of back in 2010, this was about like, pre-registration of nurses and stuff like that. It wasn't about kind of pre-registration as we think about it. And so more people are mentioning pre-registration in their studies. Open data sharing is, I think, becoming much more common as well. So again, kind of a quick and dirty search of Scopus. If you just look for abstracts that mention open data, again, we're down at about 100 down here back in 2010. Obviously, kind of replication crisis kicks in around this time, and we see a big increase into we're kind of comfortably north of 1,000 papers a year mentioning open data and abstracts. Not all these papers will be providing open data. They might be talking about open data. They might even be saying open data is a bad thing, but we'll get onto some other data in a bit that suggests that this is consistent with what we kind of see elsewhere. And then Another thing that is much more common since 2010 would be open code. And so again, just to do a quick search of Scopus, looking at abstracts that mention open code, we're not at 1,000 papers a year reporting that, but there's a big increase since kind of this baseline of 2010, kind of a year or two before the replication crisis in psychology kicked in. And so for all three of those things, I think we're kind of at about tenfold the number of papers that are talking about these things, at least in their abstracts. And you might go, well, hang on, isn't this just because like people are just publishing more than they were 13 years ago? And to some extent, that's true. So these are the number of abstracts that just mentioned the term results in there somewhere. And so we go from kind of like maybe 900,000-ish, somewhere between 800 and 900,000 in 2010, up to about 1.8 million now. And so they probably twice as many papers now are getting published than they were in 2010 that talk about kind of data and results and that kind of thing. But the mention of open research practices is kind of accelerated much faster than that. We're kind of at a kind of a tenfold increase rather than a doubling. But like I say, those are kind of quite quick and dirty searches. But if we look at kind of more carefully collected data, so there's a paper by Brian Nosek and David Lindsay from 2018, looking kind of more carefully at pre-registration. They argued that it was kind of doubling every year, the number of pre-registrations that were being made. And I think Digital Science, I think earlier on this year, published a report about kind of open data, both attitudes and actual sharing of open data, which kind of the conclusions are consistent with the data that I presented there, that it is becoming something that's much more common, and that not everybody, but a lot of scientists are kind of, a lot of researchers are kind of much more favourable towards. And so all of that is kind of good, it's progress, it suggests that we're going to be doing more transparent, hopefully more robust work. But the thing that I wanted to flag up, because it's something that I haven't done any work on, and I think maybe as a group of LNLs and kind of more widely in kind of open research, there's less work on, is peer review. And so we've got this progress in terms of transparency with things like code, analysis plans, and data, but has kind of peer review kept up with that? So the benefits of open research practices are that it makes our work more transparent, and that's a kind of inherently good. But really, what we need is somebody to do something with that transparency so that it ensures like rigor, robustness, trustworthiness, whatever you want to call it. We kind of need to go, oh, well, look, this is everything we did. You can kind of double check it. In one sense, we need somebody to do that double checking for that transparency to be really, really worthwhile. And what I think we've got some data on is that peer review hasn't really kept up with that, and we aren't making kind of effective use of the transparency that these open research practices have given us through kind of traditional peer review. And so this is a kind of relatively old paper, and kind of, if we think about the life cycle of kind of the replication crisis from kind of 2010, 2011, 2012 till now. This paper is 5 years old now, and it looks at what was happening in 2015. So this is all about clinical trial reporting. And so it's from a guy called Ben Goldacre and his team, looking at how accurate people's write-ups of clinical trials are in comparison when compared to their like analysis plans and the things that they have to pre-register before the start of a clinical trial. And so it's kind of a real-time thing that they did in 2015, kind of in the autumn of 2015, 6 weeks. And so they found 24% of the RCTs that they looked at had discrepancies in terms of what they said was going to be their primary outcome and what their actual primary outcome was in the manuscript that reported the RCT. And 45% of papers had discrepancies in terms of what the secondary outcomes were that were reported in the manuscript and what they said the secondary outcomes were going to be in their analysis plan and the RCT protocol. Now, these are like weaknesses or errors that peer review should have caught. They didn't catch them. They were in the manuscripts that got published in BMJ, in New England Journal of Medicine, things like that. And so my take here, this isn't really what this paper is about. The paper is really about what the journals did in response to this team finding the errors. But as well as, basically what they conclude is that the journals don't respond very well to errors being identified. But the other big kind of take home I think we can kind of pull out of this is that peer review in this context isn't very effective. It's doing probably a little bit of work. There's probably a bunch of trials which are kind of getting manuscripts which are being improved by peer review, but you can see that there's a bunch of papers which are getting away with things that they shouldn't be getting away with through the peer review process. But like I say, that was kind of happening, 9 years ago nearly now. Paper got published about 5 years ago. Potentially things have improved. But here's a little data from a paper that got published just a few weeks ago by Moin Saeed, who's based in the US. And they looked at whether, kind of in contrast to RCTs, kind of typical research that is pre-registered, do editors or reviewers seem to look at the pre-registration when they're reviewing a manuscript? So do they mention, oh, well, I checked the pre-registration and yes, the analysis that they did is consistent with what they said, or well, I looked at the pre-registration and actually there's discrepancies between what they said they'd do and what they actually did. So they looked at 201 published articles from the PLOS family of journals, that all had a pre-registration and that all had open peer reviews. So you can go in and check what the reviewers and editors are saying. And I'm kind of reporting the kind of better news here, because the news is kind of better when you look at an article level rather than a particular reviewer level. So 43% of articles, a reviewer or editor mentioned the pre-registration in their reviewer comments. And for 14% of the articles, a reviewer or editor reported accessing the pre-registration. So in a bunch of articles, they just go, hey, it's good that this study's been pre-registered, but it's a much smaller number of articles. Does a reviewer go, it's good that the study's pre-registered, and I actually went and checked the pre-registration. And for 10% of the articles, so this is most of the kind of 2/3 of the articles where somebody goes, oh, I went and checked the pre-registration. Do we see an instance where the reviewer goes that there's some kind of like consistency here with what's reported in the manuscript and what's reported in the pre-registration? And most of the time, this was about discrepancies. So kind of how much there was a match, how much there was overlap here. Most of the time when somebody like makes that comment going, I went and I checked and this is what I saw in terms of match, most of the time this is about discrepancies. Now, I think this is imperfect because I think you could argue that, well, the reviewers, as soon as they go, oh, it's great that this study was pre-registered, maybe implicitly they're saying, I've checked the pre-registration. But the fact that we know that for lots and lots of the time there are discrepancies between what people do in a pre-registration and what goes into a manuscript, the fact that it's pretty rare, kind of, less than 10% of the time do we see people flagging up discrepancies, whereas probably about 50% of the time there are undeclared discrepancies between pre-registration and a reported manuscript. Again, I think this suggests that peer review probably isn't working super well in this context. Okay, so both when people are reviewing RCTs and when people are reviewing kind of more typical research, I think it looks like peer reviewers aren't taking advantage of the kind of transparency stuff that people are adding to their studies through engaging in open research practices. So I think a bunch of the stuff that we do, and that I think probably as local network leads, we encourage our peers and our colleagues to do. I think that they only really work, they only help make our research more robust if someone else takes advantage of that transparency. And peer review is meant to be where that happens, but I think it probably isn't happening very effectively there at the moment. And so I think, one, there's a possibility that this will catch up, just peer review might take a little while to catch up. So the fact that Saeed was able to do this work is because of open peer review, and that wasn't something that was happening 10 or 15 years ago. That's kind of something that's become much more common over the past 10 years. So it's possible that peer review will catch up. I'm kind of skeptical that it will, because peer review isn't something that we kind of incentivize at the moment. So I think there's a possibility that we maybe need to replace kind of the way we currently do peer review with something else. And there's a bunch of platforms that kind of offer slightly different ways of doing peer review that might replace it. Or I think things like registered reports, which Grant is going to talk about next, I believe, might make kind of the kind of pressure we put on traditional peer review a little bit redundant. And so that's where I'm going to finish. Okay, thanks everybody. Okay,
Thank you.
I guess we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Am I okay to just jump in and answer these, Will? Is
Absolutely,
that okay?
go for it.
Okay, hang on, I'll stop sharing because I think I'm still sharing that now.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So apologies. So, oh God, I've lost chat again now. Going too fast. Right, so yeah, so Will says, yeah, I wonder if it's similar articles where the deposited source data as a reviewers actually look at this. And so yeah, I think there's I don't know the numbers on this, but like my gut would be that like yes, this is true. So the Saeed paper is really interesting because one of the things he kind of talks about really openly is well, I'm doing this study because I got really annoyed about a bunch of things when I was doing peer review or when I was acting as an editor. And like my experience of doing peer review, like I'll click on the link for the link that's meant to take me to the open data, and it's not there. And then the other reviewer like hasn't mentioned that at all, and you kind of think, oh well, what's going on?
I did one where I looked at the stats they had in a graph, and it was like, I don't think this is real, or the way they're reporting this. And they deposited the source data, so I looked at it and analyzed it myself, and it showed that like the effect wasn't there. And so I said, they've used an inappropriate test or something like this. And I said in my review, look, you can still publish the paper, but just say there isn't an effect here, or like, there's a trend, but it's not, we need more power, we need further studies. But no, the paper got published with them saying this effect was still there. But I think my review's open, so hopefully people can read my review and see that it's not. But even so, it's like, what's the point of having these extra things if we don't benefit from them?
Yeah. And I think, like all that takes time. So I think the other question, we need more incentives so people can more time to this. And
it sort of reminded me of, if you review a paper and it's got supplemental data or files, which they often have now, and then often there'll be a reviewer checklist, like, have you checked, are the supplemental files needed, or, are they relevant? So maybe the journals need to just add a new checklist for new open research sort of outputs and criteria.
Yeah. And I think, my other, like, the other thing that made me kind of, there's problems with the Saeed paper, but like I came across a paper recently which said that there's a pre-registration here, but the pre-registration, like it wasn't a pre-registration, it was a description of like it was kind of the abstract of the study again. And so you think, well, there's a bunch of people who've dropped the ball here. It's not just that like this kind of kind of honest errors. I'm sure this person just didn't really understand what the pre-registration was meant to look like. But yeah, like from kind of top to bottom, just that process isn't working anymore.
And with these pre-registrations for clinical trials or for sort of primary research,
just
so maybe there just aren't enough standards, or there's not. It's kind of like with metadata, like you need to write metadata in a sort of systematic way so that other people can use it, and it's maybe just not standardized enough there.
I think that's part of it. That we don't have kind of good rules about this stuff. But like the one that I'm thinking of, just it was basically just the abstract of the paper, and I got you kind of think, oh well, like how many people have dropped the ball here for this to get published. But I think I don't want to be the kind of it's the incentives guy, but like a lot of the time it is the incentives.
Incentives. One of the things we're focusing on is training of postgraduate students in how to do a review. Most of us, I think, still learn on the job. Our supervisor throws us a manuscript. There you go. Come back in a couple of hours even with some comments or something, and there's nothing there might be across certain institutions something systematic in how to peer review, but I think in general we all just learn along the way. And given that open research does have some very substantial extra steps that authors need to go through, if you're not aware of those extra steps and you're not even aware of the basics of what a review is for, then you might miss those things. And, you know, getting back to the incentives, as a journal editor myself, you know, amongst my journal, we share horror stories on how many invitations we've sent out to get one review. And, you know, when I started, it used to be approaching 10. Now it's approaching 30 and 40. And so in many ways, it does come to the incentives, because maybe people at my end of their career who should be doing peer reviews are being disincentivized to do peer reviews. We're being told, well, no, you need to spend your time writing grant applications. What that means is that early career researchers are the ones who might be taking the bulk of those reviews. And of course, they're early career researchers. They don't have the same experience. They may not have the same level of exposure to different techniques or methods. And so we're getting inexperienced reviewers to review papers. And it's maybe not surprising that, you know, some of these things slip through because we're not training people how to do it. And we're probably getting inexperienced people to do it because people like at my level are being disencouraged to do it. And so it's a kind of perfect storm in my view. And I do believe, I mean, I'm going to talk about peer review as well in my talk, but I do believe, and surveys from the large publishers tell us that researchers still believe that peer review is at the core of doing research. And so we do value it, but we're not doing it, and seemingly we're not doing it well, and that is a problem.
Will.
Yeah, I think about this a lot, and the incentives around it, and how even if you want to do it, we're also time crunched, that it's hard to, you either do it badly or you do it well and you sacrifice other things which you're more incentivized or more rewarded for. I think you could almost think of it, it shouldn't be transactional, but you could think of it in a transactional way where if I'm publishing a manuscript, let's say on average, that's going to have 3 peer reviewers, hopefully. So that means if I'm not reviewing anything, but I'm getting things published, then I'm basically benefiting from other people's labor in reviewing those things. So I don't know how you could implement this, but it would be interesting if you had a system where in order to submit a manuscript, a journal would have to check that the authors of the manuscript have completed a certain, like you get credits for doing a peer review that are maybe tracked in ORCID or something like that. And then when you submit a manuscript, every time it goes through a round of peer review, that takes away like 1 credit per reviewer that the authors have accumulated, right? So maybe the authors could share it. So it would kind of mean like you have to peer review, otherwise you can't publish things. Because otherwise it's sort of like it's like a prisoner's dilemma sort of situation where if I don't do any peer reviews, it's probably not going to cost me at all, you know, and I will then have more time. Whereas the sort of suckers who end up doing peer review, which is essential, then benefit the sort of freeloaders who aren't doing anything. So there needs to be a way of you don't want like direct financial incentives for peer review, but if we can't think of like soft career development incentives, then maybe we need like harder incentives like that. It's like, well, you can't publish unless you demonstrated that you've done some reviews. You have to have reviewer credits or something like that. But I don't know how you'd implement it. I think it'd be interesting.
I think it's probably a good idea to move on to Grant's presentation now, just as I'm conscious of the time. But it's been wonderful discussion. So I'll hand over to you, Grant.
Okay, thank you. Just wait. Zoom is not seeing my PowerPoint for some reason.
Oh, well, I'll use this opportunity as well to welcome Clement. Clement, if you want to interact, feel free to unmute yourself and share your video.
Hello.
Hello. And just
Shall
just
I
to-
just briefly introduce myself?
Sure.
I'm not a lead, but I've like been passed on this meeting by my local network lead. So yeah, and I'm interested in like what you guys are talking about. So so yeah, I'm a
Thank you.
lecturer at Newcastle University. So yeah, I'm teaching statistics, so obviously I'm interested in reproducibility and related things.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And just to let you know, this is being recorded, but we will edit out bits that are, maybe not relevant for the presentations. And if you don't want to appear in the recording, tell me and I'll make sure we edit out any bits with you in. Over to you, Grant. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, thanks, Will. So thanks for the invitation to talk. I will try to keep to 10 minutes. I just wanted to highlight some of the things. Sorry, that's my dog. If you can hear him going off. Just some of the things around register reports, and in particular in the journal that I'm an editor for, which is the Journal of Sport Sciences. And we are, I guess, what you would call a traditional journal. We've been around since '83, published by Taylor and Francis, so one of the the traditional publishers, and that has brought some positives and some challenges that we can discuss. But just to to frame it, that it's a kind of a traditional journal using a traditional publication method up until very recently. So just some background context. In 2020, we published this editorial, which was really our first foray into aspects covered by open research. And in this particular editorial, it was about the preponderance for studies in my field to have very small sample sizes. And so we wanted to address this in relation to some of the statistical aspects of it. And one of the key takeaways was just, in some ways not a scientific approach to the problem, but we just trolled through our submissions and kind of took a random sample to get an indication of what a typical sample size was for our journal. And as we expected, it was quite small. And so we wanted to outline some of the issues with that, and the bottom line and the recommendation was for researchers to address that issue, doing a priori sample size estimations. And we presented a number of different ways of doing that, not just through frequentist power, but some other methods as well. And so that was really our first go at trying to lead in the area. Given the history of the journal and its status, we thought we needed to make these issues widely known. And so we have moved on in subsequent editorials to talk about pre-registration, and there's lots of information about pre-registration already out there, so I won't go into that, but just to say that we recommend authors to pre-register their studies. But even though David presented some data on how pre-registration has increased over the years, and it's very encouraging to see that more and more researchers are doing it, in my faculty, as part of being an ethics reviewer, I wanted to know how many people submitting ethics applications were pre-registering their studies. And so we had a new question added to our ethics submission: will this study be pre-registered? And disappointingly, since we've introduced this, we've had 31 applications that have addressed this question, and only 13% have said they were going to pre-register. Small sample, of course, but just on a local level, you know, as being a local network lead, that kind of information I think is useful to give you an idea in your area how often it's being done. Now, in our faculty, it's not just my area. We have psychology, we have nursing, midwifery, paramedics, and well, we're a faculty of health sciences, just to give you some context. And some of the other things that I wanted to talk about wrap around registered reports. And one of the things that registered reports are trying to address, I guess, is this notion of getting peer review before you collect the data. And one of those issues around that is statistical support. And we have had a number of calls for researchers in my area to collaborate with statisticians. Like many fields, the statistical knowledge and training that people in my field receive in their undergraduate and postgraduate degrees is probably minimal compared to other areas. And so, you know, the number of researchers who have the core statistical analysis skills is probably quite small. And so it's natural that an easy fix for that is to collaborate with statisticians. The only problem with that is that statisticians are like hen's teeth. They are very rare and often quite expensive. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do, and that editorial on power and sample size estimation was one of the ways that I'm trying to do this, is for upskilling of people in my field of research, so that they can navigate some of these statistical issues themselves. If you can collaborate with a statistician, that's great, but I just think the opportunities for doing that are often constrained. And so we do have an issue with statistical literacy in my field, and I think we really need to address that. And registered reports is one of the ways that can be addressed. But David talked about peer review, and I agree with him that peer review is something that we really have to tackle. And again, the registered report format is a format that allows that to happen. And one of the related areas that I really think is a positive move is touted by Daniel Lakens, who's a Dutch psychologist and well, he's not a statistician, but you know, he's written quite a lot on statistics, and he has this process called his red team, where he recruits his kind of best critics, and he does that early in the process, and he calls it his red team. And this process integrates criticism into each step of the research process. Red team is designed as a devil's advocate, charged with finding holes and errors in ongoing work and to challenge assumptions with the goal of improving project quality. I don't know what it's like in your institutions, but in mine, you know, when it comes to publishing papers, and particularly for grant applications, I think we take a bit of a tick box exercise with peer review. It's one of those things that we leave too late, and it's on the checklist of things that we have to do before we submit the submit button. But I think we're paying lip service to it. And I think peer review needs to be formalized into the life cycle of a project early on, and it needs to be robust. And that's where I agree with Daniel Lakens, is that we can't just be surrounded by people who think like us. We need people who might disagree with you to challenge our assumptions. And so I really like the red team approach. And in many ways, the registered report format is like that. You know, as an editor, a registered reports editor, I can choose reviewers who are going to challenge those assumptions early on while the method is still being developed. Another thing that I think we do badly, and again, it comes back to registered reports, is that I think we publish too many papers and we need to slow down. And registered reports kind of by default allows that. You know, I don't think there's any doubt that it lengthens the time from start to publication, but that's a good thing in my view, because it means that the peer review is more robust, I would like to think, and it forces researchers to slow down and think about the research that they're doing more deeply, and I think that can only be a good thing. So we introduced registered reports in 2021 with that editorial, if you want to read that. And if for those maybe watching later on YouTube, if you're not sure what a registered report is, well, it's a process of publishing a paper that's split into 2 stages. So with a traditional peer review, you think of a project, you collect your data, and then you submit it for publication, and then it's peer reviewed. With a registered report, it's split into 2 stages where you write an introduction and a method, and you submit that to the journal for peer review, and that goes through a round of peer review, and then your paper, if it gets through peer review, it's then accepted in principle, and then you go off and analyze, collect your data and analyze it, and then resubmit it back to the same journal. And if you've received in principle acceptance, your paper will be published no matter what the results of the study. So there's lots of journals now offering registered reports, and we are one of over 300. And you might be asking, well, isn't just the same as a clinical trial registry? And yes, in some ways it is, but the crucial difference is clinical registries aren't typically peer reviewed prior to data collection. And, you know, as David pointed out with that paper by Syed, in a very similar way, there's evidence that very few reviewers of clinical research actually look at the clinical registration when they're reviewing the submitted manuscripts, and that's a real problem in my view. And so the other issue is, well, maybe it's the same as a protocol paper. Well, no, it's not the same as a protocol paper, because often you submit a protocol paper and then you start collecting data before you've even got that published. Crucially, there's no in-principle acceptance for the protocol paper. So when you write the main paper, it's still subject to publication bias. Often you submit them to different journals, so you get different reviewers, now maybe that might be a good thing, but they're not tied together. And like clinical trials, there's no guarantee that the reviewers will check your protocol to see if what you said you were going to do, you actually did. So far we've had 53 registered report submissions since 2021, and unfortunately only 3 of these have been real ones. The other 50 have been traditional studies where data were already collected. Now, why that's happening, I have no idea. Maybe authors are just confused when they select the article type. They don't know what a registered report is. Why they would then select that, I don't know. Maybe it's laziness. They're just randomly selecting something, you know, one of the article types. I don't know, but it's so overwhelmingly in a negative direction that I think we need to investigate that further. Some authors probably think a registered report is the same as a protocol, and I've had at least one instance where it's clear that the authors were thinking of starting data collection literally a couple of weeks after they've submitted the paper. And the final, I'm out of time, but the final issue I want to talk about is the editorial team itself, whether they are up to speed on what a registered report is. And some of the, some of the issues around that, simple things like making sure you send out the right invitation email. Early on, editors were sending out an invitation email for a traditional paper for a registered report. And so there was confusion around what the invitee was actually going to review. And so, yeah, so I think if you're thinking of adding registered reports to your journal, you need to make sure that the editorial team knows what a registered report is and the things that go around that. And I think clearly, I think given by the number of researchers in my field who are submitting registered reports that aren't actually registered reports, there's clearly a need for education on what a registered report is. And so that's probably enough for now.
Thank you very much, Grant. Will has put a comment or a question in the chat. But I am
yeah, conscious of the time, but
also conscious of the time,
yeah.
So I guess we have an option where we could save that and discuss it after you've done your presentation, Will, or we could spend a couple of minutes talking about it now and then go to you, Will.
I'm happy for discussion now, and then I'll try not to go over 10 minutes for my talk. And mine's more summarizing things on a European scene. I don't know how much discussion there'll be after mine. So.
Okay, then let's Grant, you.
Yeah, but you got a question? Yeah.
Yeah, my comment was basically, if we apply for funding, then in the application and the proposal, we'll outline the rationale. What are the hypotheses and aims? We'll say how we want to do them. So it's then, if they fund that, then presumably the reviewers agree with everything you're proposing and how you seek to do it and what your outcomes are. So it always seemed funny to me. But then, of course, if you get funding, quite often you deviate wildly from what you have been funded to do, depending on the circumstances, or I do at least. I mean, many people hear about. So I wonder if the publication system were more tied to what was actually described and funded in a grant proposal, then maybe that would be a way of helping researchers to focus, but also to avoid harking and things, and then take the pressure off trying to find some spurious, interesting result and just sticking to what you had planned. But I don't know how you would administer that. And I guess
I think,
sorry.
Yeah, I think there's been calls for that to happen. And given the number of publishers involved, linking up publications with funding, that would be very challenging. In principle, yeah, it's a good idea. The other thing I would say is that just because you got something funded doesn't mean that it's necessarily, the perfect method. You're relying on a couple of people, a couple of reviewers who may not have, I mean, they're supposed to be experts, but
I guess a funding proposal can be so broad as well that you're proposing a grant and that might be targeted at 3 or more publications that are outcomes of that. So for each individual one, you do need more detail and more expertise to assess it, maybe.
Yeah, and I suppose as long as the core questions that are being asked in the funding proposal are carried over to the publication, the method, I think, can always be refined, and that's where I do believe that the registered report format will help. 5 or 6 eyes are probably better than 2 or 3, and so yeah, in principle, funding should be tied to publication to make that process smoother. But yeah, the challenge would be just how it would be implemented. But I do think a lot of people are asking the question that you've asked about, I'm getting feedback, or I'm getting an approved method because of my project's been funded, but then the peer reviewers of a registered report are asking me to change or modify elements of my method. And I suppose, peer review is a two-way. It should be a two-way. And maybe with my experience with the registered report so far, it does seem to be more collegiate in that way, rather than you will do what I tell you to do as a reviewer. And so, and there are some things in a funded project that you cannot change. And you just have to say that to the reviewer. I cannot change this element of my method. There needs to be, but what you could change, I guess, is if your method doesn't relate to your hypothesis or your question, then maybe there has to be some clarification on the hypothesis. If your method is set in stone, and that's where the peer review process helps, I think, and that's what, as Lakens says, clarity in our aims and clarity in our research questions and our hypotheses are one of the areas we need to improve. And a lot of the problems we see with lack of reproducibility and replication is from vague hypotheses and vague research questions. And so, you know, things that are set in stone might have to stay there, but the things that are wrapped around that might be able to be modified in the register report process.
David, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so super quickly, I think basically Cancer Research UK have done what Will wants them to do. So I think they've got like a little, like a handful of funding streams where you can apply. The grant is basically a registered report, and they've got maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 journals, something like that. It's if you have, I think that's what they're piloting it. I think they've done a very small pilot, and then they're doing a bigger pilot with more journals. So I've popped a link into the chat, and I'll stop now so that Will can crack on.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, Will, do you want to take us away with your presentation?
Then we can see that.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all working okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about work I do that kind of is in parallel to my role as an LNL, and that's with a grouping of universities called LERU, and some of the sort of knowledge exchange and ideas we discuss around open science, open scholarship there. So the map I've got here of, let me see, here's my pointer, of the LERU institutions. Helsinki is off to the east further, I couldn't fit them in. It's 24 institutions, mainly spanning sort of Western European institutions with a big research base. Edinburgh is one of these, and they're very active around research integrity, open science, and research culture issues. So in 2018, they had a paper about this, an advice paper about open science in universities. That was then followed up in 2020 by more of a focused pathway, like a roadmap for how these concepts might be implemented. And a lot of that is based on work done previously. I think this was in 2016 by the European Commission. They've since expanded on this. And their report, I think in 2016, identified what they called 8 pillars of open science, which sounds a bit restrictive or prescriptive, but I think it captures concepts that are broadly applicable. So these were around the future of scholarly communication, so things like open access, fair data, the skills and education for training in these kinds of techniques and these concepts, research integrity, obviously, and metrics to try and capture some of these open science concepts, things around rewards and incentive, then citizen science and sort of public engagement, participatory research. There's different terms for that. And the last one's a bit more EU specific, which was an infrastructure project called the European Open Science Cloud. But this now, we're currently revising these pillars. This is generally around infrastructures for open science. So these pillars were addressed and incorporated into this roadmap, and how can we make progress along these sort of broad goals in universities? And one way that LERU identified to do that was for its member institutions to generate their own roadmaps for open research. So we've done that at the University of Edinburgh. Not all the LERU institutions have very well established ones, but we've actually done pretty well, I think, in Edinburgh at generating a roadmap. This is a link to the roadmap we had. Initially, it was published in 2022, then it was updated in January last year. We may have another update. I should probably know that, but I can't recall exactly. And the roadmap, again, it touches on these 8 pillars, but we added an overarching sort of pillar, an umbrella around cultural change. And this is the recognition that really to change some of the practices and to advance some things, you have to change the culture of research in which we're operating. And so just to say, in this roadmap, we have each of the aspects then is sort of graded by a traffic light system of we've not done it, it's in progress, or we have more or less achieved that. So this one for leadership is in orange. So I'm listed here as the LERU Open Science Ambassador. And whenever I say this, half of the people laugh at me and they think of the Ferrero Rocher advert and say, oh, you're an ambassador for open science. So maybe in UKRN, we shouldn't have local network leads. We could have local ambassadors or something, and it would sound more haughty. But my role is, I'll talk about in a bit about what the open science ambassadors do, but it's kind of to reflect on our policies and processes and progress around these aspects within the university, and then to learn what the other institutions are doing. So each institution has an open science ambassador. There's 24 now in LERU. Some of them probably haven't appointed one, but most of us have. So effectively, within an institution, I'm talking to the many people here around open science issues. So this is really very similar to the role of local network leads from a UKRN perspective, I think. Because let's say at the University of Edinburgh, I mean, there's going to be like the library team looking at infrastructure for open science and the data access policies and publication policies and things like that, copyright policies, which we just updated. But there's also going to be like HR looking at rewards and incentives and how do we fold these things into career progression, education skills. Do we need formal teaching for postgrads or undergrads, or even PIs and staff training for these things? So there's lots of things to address here. And so part of my job is to try and get my head around what's going on at the University of Edinburgh. And whenever I speak to people from different institutions, whether in LERU or UKRN, it's clear that lots of the activities around research integrity and open research sort of happen in silos and underneath the radar. And so it's really hard to get hold of what's going on at the institutional level. But then having to sort of communicate what's happening within my university and try and coordinate some things in a sense, but it's more like knowledge exchange and saying, oh, by the way, these people are doing this and this is happening here. We then get together every 3 months with the OSAs and hopefully once a year in person to talk to each other. And we give sort of testimonials about what's happening in my institution. And the goal there is to try and figure out policies and needs, challenges, goals, solutions around these issues. Some of them might be unique to that country or that institution. Some of them are common. Can we find best practices or things that haven't worked? So it's kind of a data sharing exercise to try and learn what works, what doesn't, etc. We also have working groups, and I'm part of one around next generation metrics. And so as part of that, we were trying to assess national level policies, how they're monitored, and then other things about open science monitoring in general around the LERU institutions and around the countries that they're in. So very, very quickly and unhelpfully, I'm just going to show a table that summarizes this. The slides are all in the open science framework. And so I put the DOI at the front, and I can pop that in the chat as well. So if we look at the countries, just listed alphabetically from A to Z, we've again ranked them for the policies, the monitoring of different things as green, amber, or red. So there's all the links here, and I'll just give some sort of summaries from this at the end. But effectively, most countries do have a national policy. Not all of them monitor it in an obvious way, but they may have some other extra monitoring of open science that isn't necessarily tied to the policy. And then if you look at the individual LERU universities, they may have their own policies that, they can be a bit more nimble. And so they might decide to have a policy before their country implements something. And they might have their own monitoring, although that's there isn't as much publicly available monitoring on an institutional level, at least from what we've seen. But many countries have good national monitoring. Finland is excellent. France has a really good plan and monitor for open science, but it's not necessarily tied to the national policy. There's not really any overarching national policy in Germany. It's more tied to the research funding organizations. I will talk about the Charity Berlin dashboard, which is excellent. Again, so sorry to rush through these, but there's a lot here. Ireland recently launched a national action plan and they're developing monitoring, but just general open science monitoring is not there. Italy equally just launched a national plan in 2022, but these other things are more in process. Spain, I'll highlight as a good example as well, now has dedicated funding of around 24 million euros per year for the next 4 years, or until 2027. But again, the monitoring of that is not in place. So it's interesting, sometimes you divert resources to policies, but then how do you know what they're actually doing? You'd think they'd put the monitoring in place for that. Very quickly here, sorry. Slides are not behaving themselves. There we go. Switzerland, again, similarly very advanced for policies. The Netherlands, as you might expect, is excellent in many regards. They really put a lot of support, including dedicated funding to back this up. What's interesting in the Netherlands is they're also tying this into rewards and incentives for researchers, which you don't see very commonly elsewhere. And here's the UK. I've got the UK reproducibility program and our open research program as well. I'm aware that this may not be accurate, and some of you may know more about this than I do, but it's interesting. I think the next ref, with its emphasis on the culture and environment, that might be driving some of the changes that we need. So just quickly to spotlight some good practice, Finland is really advanced and excellent in terms of its monitoring of open science national policies. There's all the links here that you can explore more, but they really have a really a logical framework for how they monitor these. They've already done several annual monitorings, and so they've got some good lessons learned from that they're implementing now. France has this plan here. France stands out, I think, for having a national level open science monitor, which is pretty good. You can look at open access publications and some data as well, and they pull that data out of research databases, publication databases in quite a nice way. And then Spain, I mentioned, has extensive funding, and they're looking at these different pillars, again, with this issues around incentives and recognition being very important. So then there's also, beyond national borders, sort of international monitors. If none of you have seen the Charity Berlin dashboard, it's probably the best one, I think, for looking really in a granular way at different aspects around open science aspects, not just for primary research publications, but also for some clinical trials as well. I don't know if they've got things like registered reports there yet, but that's really worth having a look at. And then for like an institutional level, the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative is really good. It doesn't provide the same amount of granularity, but it might tell you about the percentage of open access publications by country. So in any country in the world effectively, or you can look at institutions by region. And so it's interesting to see how your institution is doing against others in the country, for example, but there's lots of different ways you can look at this. It's really nice. So that's kind of a quick tour of what's going on. Some general conclusions are that there's a real variation in the open science activities and support, and whether there's funding to back these up based on the institution or the country. We're really far along with open access publications. I think most people are aware of that. Things are getting there around FAIR data. There's policies there, but it's not quite so established yet. And how do we monitor that is still sort of a work in progress, I think. And then we've got these other aspects of open science, whether we think of them from the LERU perspective or just more broadly. And there really isn't established monitoring or policies around many of these things yet, but I think they'll be emerging. So something we're trying to do in LERU, and I think with the REF changes in the UK, where they're trying to evaluate research culture and environment, they still want metrics to somehow capture that, which I think is quite a complex task. It will be interesting to see what metrics they come up with, and can those metrics be used in an even-handed and logical way, or are they just going to slip back into bad habits of saying this number is better than that number and then not think about anything else? It'll be interesting to see where things go, but I think those are some of the developments from a European perspective. So that's a summary from me.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we have passed 3. So I will say we'll probably wrap up in a minute rather than have any further discussion.